Buenos dias.
We are glad to have you this morning here in UTB. What I'm showing you is our community of students of solutions basic on ecosystems. Some students of the class of hydraulics and some students from just beginners, some of them. Um, I already did the introduction of your biography, and
Yeah, I saw it. I heard it. So thank you.
yeah, we are really looking forward to share this morning with you. And we do appreciate your time and your dedication sharing with us. So you had the stage, and thank you
Thank you.
very much again. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. Um, I will share my screen. Let me see. Yes. So for my presentation, I brought a selection of slides and with this agenda. So I will start with a introduction or context. I will share some experience from the Netherlands and especially the Dutch Delta program. Then some case studies from the USA, one in New Orleans, one in New York. And then I will close off with some conclusions and also thoughts for a discussion. To start with the introduction, in the Netherlands, we have a tradition in flood defenses, building dikes. A large part of our country is below sea level. And we have sort of let's say re-evaluate this flood protection because we cannot continue with only having dikes regarding climate change, sea level rise, but also extreme weather events. So in 2009, the multi-layered safety approach was introduced. Besides flood prevention, that also includes spatial adaptation in the second layer behind the dikes. So that is having a sort of resilient cities, but also our land use. We have to decide on that it fits coping with extreme weather events, but also will foster livability. And then eventually it is also about dealing with calamities and responses to disasters. More recently, a fourth layer was added, and besides being adaptive, what is rather reactive, it is also about transformative, more proactive. And that is a little bit following the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So building back better in response to disasters. What it is also about is living with water. And in a few weeks, the United Nations will organize a world conference on water. And it's really about living with water. It is not only fighting the water, but also the water is bringing life and economic development. So we have to embrace it as well. And we can actually benefit from it, like an ecosystem service. And uh, over almost 25 years ago, we introduced the living with water principles, and that's both quantitative in retention, delaying the water, and only drain it or discharge it when necessary. But it's also about water quality as well, um, in prevent pollution, then making it in different qualities, and then eventually it also is about water treatment. And interesting, it is also not only engineering, but it is also about planning, especially when looking at cities and deltas, urbanized deltas. We call that delta urbanism. And designers really like to introduce or analyze the landscape in what we call layers. And in those layers, so we have the substratum, that's the subsurface. We have networks like drainage, but also roads, rail, canals, rivers. And we have the occupation, the land use. And what we see is that water in different sorts, but also the soil is in all those layers. So you could say or consider those as guiding principles, what we call them. Um, and that was also, so we can actually integrate that in when looking at water and climate change, and then integrate it in a multifunctional strategy. And this was actually the design we made for Hoboken, the waterfront at the Hudson River in New York. The Dutch Delta program actually started in response to a big national flood event. So almost 2,000 people died in 1953, and it was called the Delta Works, and that was really making shorter lines of defense, flood defenses with barriers and dikes, uh, building the threshold. And then end of the 20th century, there was several years of river flooding, so fluvial floodings. And then the program, The Room for the River, was introduced. We called that the second Delta Works. And more recently, spatial adaptation was introduced, like a sort of third Delta Works, more focusing on cities and its environments. Um, the spatial adaptation is a Delta plan within the Delta program. So the program is, let's say, like the policy or the national government policy. And the plan is more the execution of how regional and local institutions will implement it. And of course, also the Netherlands is experiencing climate change. So, because we are part below sea level, we have very much focus on the sea level rise, but also we have experience in uh, increase of precipitation intensity, river discharge, but also dry periods and heat stress. And this is also the climate stressors where spatial adaptation is focusing on. So it is about impact of urban flooding, uh, also because of high water levels in rivers, but also along the coast. It's about pluvial, so rain intensity. It's about drought, longer periods of water deficit, and heat stress. And it follows a triple A approach, what we call, what we use within the spatial adaptation process with stakeholders. So first, we want to understand the system, both the water system and the landscape. We call that the analysis. And it's both the vulnerabilities, but also opportunities. So where are synergies to be found? And in the second stage, it is about ambition. It's developing a strategy for a city or a region. And then it's about making those strategy implementable, but also bankable in the sense of financing. And implementable, of course, going to having a selection of actions. And this is always tailored, of course. So this is just a more, let's say, governance approach. Um, and they're tailored for the Netherlands. We introduced some, let's say, ambitions, but also goals for the Netherlands. So one is that we expect from all stakeholders that there will be that they will embed climate-proof and water-resilient action in their policies and behavior. And then we have to work on a transition to a climate-proof and water-resilient spatial design by 2050. And to organize that, the Netherlands is divided in regions, consultative bodies and working regions that they will pick up or implement those actions. And of course, it comes with a planning. Still, we are now and then we evaluate where we are, and we also experiencing that the implementation is slow, and at the same time climate change doesn't wait and is accelerating. So we in a way it feels a little bit that we are behind. To support all this process, we developing instruments like for the first ambition, the analysis, understanding the system. We developed a climate stress test, so you can actually map rainfall intensities and floodings. You can see drought, stress, etc. And this is an example of those maps. So you have the waterlogging in cities, but also the urban flooding when a dike breach is happening. It is also about understanding the vital and critical functions in infrastructure, like communication, energy. It is about roads and connectivity. It is also about the multi-stakeholder process and to have a dialogue on this. And interesting, and that this is also what we used in New Orleans in the USA. That was called the Dutch dialogues, to talk with all the stakeholders, but then in a structured way. And of course, developing that strategy and then find this common ground to have that, let's say, co-ownership, co-owned strategy. And this is an example from the city of Zwolle in the Netherlands, where we reckoned that there are 3 spatial scales. So we have the neighborhood scale, a city-wide scale, and a region scale. And for each of those scales, you have to organize with different stakeholders and also with different interests. And then, of course, it is about implementation. And currently, we still are in the phase of having impact projects or demonstration projects. It's about community initiatives because a large part of cities is privately owned. It's about startup organized incentive programs. And it is not only about 2050, because that is only already in 30 or less than 30 years. It is also about can we still live in this delta even in 100 years or maybe beyond? And how sustainable is the Netherlands? That is for our country the big question currently. So these are some pictures that show about subsidence, salt intrusion because of sea level rise. It's about the drought stress regarding agricultural, urban development, etc. And we sort of working on this sort of futuristic visions in 100 years. So how does the Netherlands will look like in 2120, for instance? So is the Netherlands retreat, and then we will live on the higher areas, maybe even in the neighboring countries like Belgium or Germany? Or do we move towards the sea and build new islands or new dunes? Or will we remain and continuing strengthening the dikes, but then maybe embrace more or give more room for green and blue solutions? Um, Within this background, I have worked in the USA, and it was mostly in response to catastrophic disasters like hurricanes. New Orleans was hit by the Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and was followed by what we call the Dutch dialogues, because at that moment the first reaction was to build back all the flood defenses and introduce new barriers, but there was no attention at all to the city itself within the interior of the flood defense. So we worked on what we called the Greater New Orleans Water Management Strategy that was actually awarded a National Planning Excellence Award. And then in 2012, the area around New York and New Jersey was hit by the storm and Hurricane Sandy that initiated the Rebuild by Design competition. Was a competition, but then started as a sort of multi or transdisciplinary a way of working, what we already did in New Orleans, but then more formal. And I was in the team for Hoboken to work on the resist, delay, store, discharge strategy. And it was also awarded by the United Nations for a role model city strategy. And this was actually the sort of initiative that eventually evolved to what we now know as water as leverage. Also started in Cartagena at this moment. Um, Looking at New Orleans, this is a picture just after the floodings. And interesting is that how we can compare. I have pictured this together with the delta in the Netherlands on the right, and to the left the Mississippi Delta, in the same scale, and also to show to sort of motivate that Dutch US dialogue, that we both are in a delta. And what is also very distinct is that a big part of the city of New Orleans is below sea level, like we already experience in the Netherlands. There was a whole coalition, many institutions like education, research, practitioners, engineers, both in the US and the Netherlands, were working together in developing this water management strategy. At that time, I was with Royal Haskoning, still without DHV. And interesting is that we looked at first, of course, that Katrina really illustrated the vulnerability of a delta city in New Orleans, and that the protection system, the dikes and the levees, was designed for 100 years to cope with a 100-year storm. And that was already done or underway. So our focus within the water management strategy was more to deal with subsidence, with extreme rainfall, making better places, livelihood, like blue-green in the city, and eventually make that a more livable city, and also for the next 100 years or beyond. Yeah, this is the picture of the flood defense, so the hurricane protection system surrounding all the city and the parishes within New Orleans. And interesting is that 1/3 of the interior within the flood protection is wetlands, although a lot of like trees were disappeared, and it was also more salt. So to let's say develop more biodiversity and green, you need the fresh water again to introduce and develop that cypress trees, restore that wetlands. And we looked at the city more. Okay, the water is coming from different sides. So we have the sea because of the Gulf of Mexico. We have the river, the Mississippi. We have precipitation from the sky, and we have the soil and groundwater from below. And this is the daily practice. So it is not only hurricanes. So this is let's say, on a yearly basis, extreme rainfall is happening in New Orleans, especially during the wet season. This is also happening during the dry period or dry season, when because of the water management was very much focused on discharging the water. So there's no water left to, let's say, keep that soil moist and wet, and to avoid damage to constructions during subsidence. And this is what the relation was with society and in the city with his water system. So the water system is or covered up or buried below the city, or it is behind the wall, like this. This is actually one of the outfall canals you cannot see. There's no relation at all, although it is a water city. It used to be in history. So we introduced the living with water principles for the delay, store, and drain approach, and to see where we can have interventions like retention, detention, recycling, or reuse. Then store the water in the system, maybe in the ground, or recharge it to limit subsidence, and then only discharge it when necessary. And I was part of the water system analysis, and I did quite some calculations on that water balance, and we calculated what we called the water assignment, and it was actually for water storage. And this is a visual that shows you how much on scale extra water, so additional water storage, has to be implemented. And also wanted to show this approach where the calculations link with the urban design. So that is on the bottom right, the urban topologies. And that is what the urban designers do and the landscape architects, to look at cities and how the cities have a certain use, like historical city center, dwelling areas, industrial areas. They all have a different sealed surface, but also another use. They have another vulnerability to water extremes, and they will have different solutions like the ecosystem services or nature-based solutions. And then, of course, we can calculate those, what the effect is, and that links to the water system in its partly constructed and partly in a natural way. And eventually we came up with a proposal for the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan. And it was 10 years ago. And the follow-up was that there in the district of Gentilly, so the Gentilly neighborhood, there was a resilience pilot project, was funded $100 million. And we started with one rain garden. Today we have over 200 rain gardens in that neighborhood. And recently we still do measurements, monitoring on those, because we really want to know what the effect is of introducing all this blue, green, and nature-based solutions in the city, and to motivate, of course, the investments of this area. Moving to the New York area, this is actually a picture the day or the morning after Hurricane Sandy, and this is the island of Manhattan. This is the south area where Wall Street is. And you can imagine with this power outage that there was no trade possible at Wall Street. And it actually also caused the biggest damage during that week. It was not that much casualties, but it was especially an economic damage or affecting the economy. This is actually the map of the whole affected area. So it was not only limited to New York State, but also other states like New Jersey were hit. It was the second costly hurricane after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, over 50 billion of damages in dollars. And the response was that there were several initiatives. There was a special initiative for rebuilding and resilience. Really interesting because resilience was then really embraced or introduced. And before, let's say, during Katrina or after Katrina, that was not used yet. There was also already work on what we call the Green Infrastructure Plan, and there was this initiative Rebuild by Design as a competition to let's say collect ideas and suggestions for rebuilding this area. Yeah, and so and there were already some technical sound strategies, although there were still barriers. And so how could we organize these strategies in stakeholder involvement and having a buy-in? What is in it for me? It is also about the financial aspect, um, because it was still very fragmented. Interesting was that this was a completely different response than after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, because it was not reacting or okay, we have to rebuild the levees or the flood defenses, but this was seen as an opportunity to combine it with green infrastructure and also to have multifunctional uh, um, infrastructure in urban areas. And the then mayor of New York, he said a flood wall doesn't have to be just a wall, it can also be an elevated park or boardwalk and still block the floodwaters. And it was also about introducing things like urban livability, livelihoods. And that was, I think, really a game changer. So I think what the Dutch costed maybe over a century, in the US, it only took a decade to understand that from, let's say, a technical approach to a more integrated, multifunctional, transdisciplinary approach. So, yeah, the Rebuild by Design, actually, it was a sort of pre-water as leverage competition. It was especially focused on design, urban design, but then still had to let's say motivate and to come with uh, a suggestion for funding, and that it has to be bankable and fundable. And it was also an opportunity for a more overarching plan because it collected, of course, many ideas, but then, of course, also the common objective. I was part of the team OMA, the Office of Metropolitan Architecture, based in Manhattan. And we were focusing on the city of Hoboken, opposite of New York City, at the same river, the Hudson River, but then in a different state, New Jersey. And Hoboken is a part that was reclaimed from the river. So it used to be marshlands, low lying, below the Palisades of New Jersey, and reclaimed from the river. So it is showing this on this painting of the 19th century. And this is more in detail. And why we focused on Hoboken was that this was smaller than, of course, New York City. And it has to be it has to demonstrate a strategy. So we had less stakeholders to involve and less area. and it was also very much affected. And this shows you the effect of the flood surge uh, during Hurricane Sandy. So to the north, you have the surge coming in because of the low-lying waterfront, and also from the south, there is an entry point, and there is flash flooding because of heavy rainfall. And you see in the middle, because this area is one of the most dense urban areas in the US, and it has a 94 percentage of impervious or sealed surfaces. So there's no infiltration at all, and it's all quick runoff. Um, and there's also no room for or even having green or a relation with water, although this was the flooding. And there was also an understanding that it is not about protecting utilities or, let's say, buildings or infrastructure on a local scale. It is about a community broad protection. Together, we have to uh, make a combined, more, let's say, a whole community approach rather than protecting only the building. And this is an example of the fire station that is to the right. And it doesn't make sense, of course, to have a flood protection around the fire station, for example, uh, because then a fire truck would not be able to go out or in the fire station. That is the same with hospitals or with other vital infrastructure. We came actually up with a sort of second version of the New Orleans strategy. In New Orleans, we focused on the delay, store, and drain strategy. And we combined this with the resist. So that would be, let's say, the storm surge protection, the threshold. And of course, in between, there is the engagement with community and stakeholders, including finance as well. And this was a sort of illustration of the whole idea to have resist at the locations of the entry points, the low-lying waterfront, combined with a discharge point, delay in the whole city, and then a major storage that is a multifunctional or a sort of blue-green belt behind the city. So for the resist, we looked at, okay, multifunctionality. So it could be like an elevated park, or maybe a flexible flood wall, maybe a multifunctional waterfront, like this, next to the train station, and also the ferry station opposite of Manhattan. So there's just some pictures of that. And actually, it was included the once per 200 years or even maybe 500 years flood event. And to the north, the raised park, and also combined with a wetland, a sort of treatment for water quality as well, and with bioretention basins. And then in the city, the delay measures that could be like water parks, rain gardens, bioswales, green roofs. And this was one of the main streets in Hoboken that used to be, or is still, very wide and all with sealed surface, so paved, tarmac. And what we introduced to make it more friendly for people to walk in, having porous paving, having a little bit more of green for infiltration or to retain the water. And it is already implementing right now. And then we need, of course, still a larger intervention, and that is the store part. And for this, we looked at the light rail connection because it was in the backbone of the city. And we looked at maybe we can combine that with a linear park that also could serve as a blue ribbon during heavy extreme rainfall or rainfall intensity. And then eventually, sometimes we have to drain water as well. So we have to need pump station, especially on the low-lying areas. So we call that the wet weather pumps. And this is the combination of all the components in the city. And for this, we reached out to the community with stakeholders, and we developed multiple tools to do that, like the Flood Risk 101. We made a simulation, like a sort of game, a serious game. We did a survey with people living or people in transit, working in Hoboken, expositions, and to tell the story and to collect reactions, ideas, engagement, like events, etc. And then collecting a lot of letters of support because this has to be implemented, and we need the support and that everyone is sort of agreeing that this will be the future strategy. And this is, I think, still the most famous render we made, including the once per 500-year flood defense in a multifunctional dike and waterfront. Um, so I will conclude with this slide. It's only one slide with some conclusions and maybe some things for discussion. I really in favor in the transdisciplinary approach, the integrated adaptation. So spatial adaptation is about engineering, the water system analysis, but it is also about landscape, architectural, and urban design. So it is really about that bridging that gap to start with, and that could be like water sensitive design, maybe nature-based solutions. It is also to neutralize some of the challenges, so to sort of find a certain focus, because there are so many challenges going on also in the transition, like sustainability, circular energy. Um, and then throughout the interventions, and that is what we still do in New Orleans, for example, is evaluate effectiveness. So see, do the interventions work? Do they have an impact on the bigger goal or an ambition? It is also about engagement with community and stakeholders, and to create co-ownership. Maybe a multi-actor model to accelerate the regional adaptation. And it's really hard because a lot of institutions and interests are in silos. Maybe it could help. What we at Deltares we're really good in the dynamic adaptive policy pathways, because of first you start with a futuristic vision 100 years away, and then maybe backcasting to now and see what major interventions or system decisions has to be made in that path towards the future. And maybe there are different paths. And when is there a sort of tipping point, for instance, in having sea level rise, or we have to sort of abandon maybe part of the city and then move towards another, like what we showed for the Netherlands. So when do we retreat or not? The ownership, political and also community, is very vital. It is really about co-ownership. And I think it is also about moving from a cost-benefit approach to more a social cost-benefit approach. It's also about social benefits rather than only have benefits on your bank account. So it's a livability above life cycle. We can also, of course, use tools for that, for the decision making. I think it's really important to have instruments like dashboards or decision support systems for that. And we have to build on case studies and pilots, demonstration projects, because those are really good to learn from. And part is about nature. We are part of a natural system, because before the city, it was just a natural landscape, and we are sort of guests in that landscape. And we can learn from the natural processes, and they're always location specific. Um, um, yeah, and that is interesting also for an area like Cartagena. And it is beyond theory and look at practice. So we have to not stick in the discussion about, let's say, for like climate scenarios. We have to start building and then carefully monitor existing interventions and see what works and what doesn't work. It is also in that context, in a sort of cultural, in a sort of social cultural perspective as well, and maybe also partly the heritage of a city. And then, and that is also what we really like, is the transnational learning and think or twinning. So looking at what other areas in the world or in the region are facing the same challenges as us and where we can learn from. What are their decisions, ambitions, or interventions going on? Okay, I leave it with this. Thank you very much. Perhaps there are questions or still
Sí,
time for some discussion.
sí, gracias. Gracias por su atención todos a la presentación de Nanco. So now we are going to have some questions, Nanco, from the public. Is you are okay with that?
Yes, I'm okay.
I will translate the question and then
Yeah,
I will try to do a summary of your answer. If you think that that's okay.
okay. Yeah,
Bueno, estamos entonces en la sesión de preguntas, sobre todo desde pues, toda la experiencia que Nanco nos puede aportar y desde lo que hemos discutido en clase y en diferentes espacios, yo les agradezco las preguntas que tengan sobre temas de agua, de inundación, sus inquietudes sobre Cartagena. Roberto tiene el micrófono y se lo puede dar a la persona que quiera hacer la pregunta. La pregunta la pueden hacer en español, yo la voy a traducir al inglés, Nanco nos va a contestar. Para aquellos que tengan la inquietud acerca de la asistencia, hay dos hojas verdes que están circulando con nombre, código y clase a la que ustedes asisten. Les agradezco que las hagan circular, no se queden con ellas, para que podamos hacer seguimiento de la asistencia al evento y puedan recibir su bonificación de 0.5% sobre la definitiva del corte número 1. Entonces, preguntas. Roberto. Roberto, después de allá, acá en la tercera fila hay otra pregunta. Adelante.
Good morning, Doctor. So I have a question for the planning of the solution with the floating system for accumulate water. If is soft infrastructure changing the paradigm that we were used that were used at the Tokyo floating system for storm tanks. If you use the solution they planned and built back in 90s at Tokyo City, it was a vision for changing the paradigm from the hard infrastructure to soft infrastructure to the soil absorption, which will help to um, the system for no overcharging the capacity and make a smaller infrastructure for accumulating water and for redirecting the floods for the risk management of the flooding from the coast. and the storm events with a return period over 100 years.
So what is the question? So I can translate to the
Mhm.
public. I mean, very short, what is the question?
If it was just the system were used back in Tokyo for projecting the new solution uh, over the Hoboken system
Mhm.
projected in New York, which which is in over construction right now. I
So if there
Yeah,
is a relationship between the Tokyo solution
yeah,
and
there.
the
Yeah,
Hubbox project.
yeah, I can. Yeah, that's I think a good question. I can elaborate a little bit because I'm also quite familiar with the Tokyo, let's say, um, measures and implementation. Tokyo experienced a quite some subsidence until the 1970s. And also what they experienced besides floodings is of course had a increase of rainwater deficit. So they are lacking water supply. So what they did is, and that is partly not really nature based because it is about having this bigger constructed cisterns underneath the city to collect water. It's also what they did is to differentiate different qualities of water throughout the city for different purposes. For instance, to flush your toilet, you don't necessarily need the drinking water quality. So, and I think it's really inspiring that a city such as Tokyo, with 40, I don't know, 50 million people, uh, is a sort of transformed to a full rainwater harvesting collector in that way. And then, of course, mitigating both the extreme rainfall as well as retaining water or saving that water for later use in the city. And I think that's interesting. And another example could be the city of Singapore as an island state surrounded by salt water and to the ambition to be more self-sufficient in that way. Yeah.
So I'm going to try to translate for the
Yeah,
rest of
that's
the
fine.
people. La pregunta, entendemos que estaba relacionada con el caso de la ciudad de Tokio, es una ciudad de 30, 40, 50 millones de habitantes, y su sistema de agua y cómo está relacionado podía haber sido inspiración para otros casos, como el caso de Nueva York. Entonces, Nanco nos comenta que lo que hace inspiracional el caso de Tokio es que el sistema de agua servía a varios propósitos y de manera muy interesante tenía también elementos que involucraban la idea de que no necesitas para ciertos usos la mejor calidad de agua. Por ejemplo, para bajar un inodoro, no necesariamente necesitabas un agua con el mejor nivel de tratamiento, sino que podía ser agua colectada o tratada bajo diferentes procesos para servir a ese tipo de usos. Y la comparación la lleva también a otros elementos, incluyendo cómo el sistema podía servir no solamente para control de lluvias, sino para una perspectiva como mucho más integradora. Eso a grandes rasgos y ciertamente se pierde algo en traducción, pero he hecho mi mejor esfuerzo. Vamos a proceder con la siguiente pregunta.
Bueno, mi pregunta es si nosotros podríamos implementar ese plan de Resist, Delay, Stores and Discard en Cartagena para suprimir de que en algunos años el nivel del mar va a subir y va a abarcar algunas partes de la ciudad.
Muy buena pregunta. So what he's asking is this philosophy that you show us in different places, the philosophy of resist, infiltrate, delay, and when you can do nothing else, well, you pump, right? So if that kind of philosophies are possible to be implemented in places like Cartagena, considering the particular challenges that the city has?
Hmm. Yeah, I think the for a water management approach, it can be applied and is although it is always in a way tailored. And I showed you also this four quadrant approach in linking the urban design or the landscape design and then connect it with the engineering side. So you have to, and that we already did, Mauro, in the setting the scene. So making a sort of typically different kinds of water systems. So we have different kinds of coasts. We have different, let's say, areas of urban. We have river systems. We have canals. So in this, so it is not only having the interventions in the resist, delay, store, and discharge, but it is also to understand really the water system in its functionalities, and also both the constructed as well as the natural system. And that's really important. But then I think the philosophy can be. It is also seen the same philosophy in China for the Sponge City program, for instance.
Pues la respuesta que él nos da es que en efecto las filosofías van a tener la limitación de que cada caso específico tiene sus particularidades, cada sitio tiene su sistema de drenaje diferente, sus suelos diferentes. Sin embargo, es posible entendiendo la naturaleza del sistema natural, entendiendo la integralidad de los sistemas, poder proponer soluciones que involucren esa filosofía. Así como, por ejemplo, pues no solamente todos los casos que mostró, menciona él el caso de China con sus ciudades esponja, en donde esos principios de desaceleración del flujo, infiltración, manejo de capacidad fueron implementados y funcionaron. Muy buena pregunta. Tenemos otra pregunta de este lado.
Para preguntar, en el caso de Nueva York, ¿cómo van a implementar la naturaleza como base a la solución de este problema, teniendo en cuenta que Nueva York es una ciudad que está contaminada? Y también si ese es uno de los desafíos que dice que hay que neutralizar en estos casos.
Muy buena pregunta. So what he's asking is for the New York case, considering the level of, I mean, it's a highly urbanized place, and it's also with the different kinds of water, they had different levels of contamination, right? So we considering those challenges, how do you think that can work nature-based solutions in a place like that with those big challenges?
Yeah, and especially in this urban, very dense context. Yeah, and of course, so behind what's interesting is that there were 10 teams, 10 designs, and so west of Hoboken in New Jersey, you have the Meadowlands. That is a sort of, I would say, a sort of bayou or sort of river system, maybe a sort of lagoon, more natural land. And that could be the bigger, that was really a nature-based strategy. I think for Hoboken, we very much focused on a water management strategy, although we see now already some implementation what could be recognized as nature-based, like the rain gardens. And those rain gardens are in the city, like smaller parks, but they are having this multiple types of vegetation, like also flowers for insects, and they can actually mitigate rainfall in the streets. Although I have a picture of last year during Storm Irma, there was the hurricane in Florida that actually was weakened down to a storm in New York, and it completely flooded Hoboken, including all the rain gardens. So those nature-based solutions have a certain effect, but also in the very extremes, you need another scale. This also is an example of the conflict, almost like having this very much occupied and urbanized area with only little room for having blue-green solutions. Right, yeah, that's a good question.
Nanco nos dice que es una muy buena pregunta y ciertamente una ciudad tan altamente urbanizada, con esa densidad de urbanización tan alta, plantea un reto muy grande para la implementación de soluciones basadas en naturaleza. Sin embargo, nos habla de que había un sector que tenía como más acceso a elementos naturales, a laguna, a río, y allí sí, pues se podía manejar soluciones que involucraran cierta área extensa con elementos naturales, pero para el sector más urbanizado, la parte de Manhattan, él pone el ejemplo de los jardines de lluvia. Los jardines de lluvia son básicamente, si tú los ves, están sobre la calzada o sobre los andenes y son, es una zanja glorificada. Básicamente tienes, en la parte de arriba luce como un jardín con piedras y vegetación, pero ayuda a infiltrar el agua dentro del suelo y es una medida que uno puede utilizar en áreas altamente urbanizadas porque se coloca en los andenes, en parqueaderos y cosas por el estilo y sirve para hacer infiltración y reducción de velocidad de flujo. Entonces, incluso en situaciones altamente urbanizadas es posible utilizar recursos como eso para utilizar elementos naturales. Entonces, ciertamente un reto en el caso de Nueva York, pero sí se pudieron involucrar ese tipo de soluciones. Otra pregunta, creo que tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta. We had time for the last question. ¿Alguien más? ¿Allá?
Hi, Nando. So, you showed to us a little bit like a future plan for enable green zones, right? So my question is like, how can we implement here that solution, like able to some green zones?
What place? What solution are you talking about?
About the solution that implements so blue greens, I mean.
Blue and green solutions?
Yeah.
Okay. So what he's asking is, considering the particular case of Cartagena, how can you implement in a place like this more blue and green inspire solutions?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, yeah, so part it is about connecting those urban planning with the more, let's say, the engineered solutions. Although it doesn't is not let's say limited to that, and it is also, especially in, I think in Cartagena, it's really also about the political and the social context as well, and it is also not coming with a sort of standard toolbox. So you have to develop, although that approach of the delay, store, discharge, and the resist could help, and there, like the World Bank, they offer this catalog of nature-based solutions for cities. That is, of course, really good inspiration. But I think Cartagena has to be, or could have the potential to develop its own sort of catalog or toolbox of those nature-based solutions that are, let's say, embraced by the governmental institution, maybe by other stakeholders and actors that are embraced because they have to be maintained. They have to be, the people and community have to feel a certain co-ownership with its these blue-green solutions because they're partly maybe public space, but also partly maybe private areas as well. So that it needs more than only design engineering for that.
Thank you. Bueno, la pregunta es muy buena y nos preguntaban si estas soluciones verdes, azules, involucrando naturaleza podían funcionar en en una ciudad como Cartagena. Y lo que él nos dice es que considerando el contexto social, económico, político particular de la ciudad, aplica para Cartagena y aplica para cualquier lugar del mundo. Si bien los principios de diseño que estábamos discutiendo, retener, infiltrar, descargar, son universales. Cada lugar debería, en lo posible, desarrollar su propia caja de herramientas, considerando los elementos específicos del lugar y, en el caso particular de Cartagena, pues considerando nuestros retos, especialmente en el tema de gobernanza, especialmente en el tema de lograr coordinar esas visiones del sector público, privado y sociedad civil. So, quiero agradecer nuevamente la participación de todos ustedes. Yo creo que el evento, con sus limitaciones, ha sido pues interesante, ha aportado y creo que esto va a ser una primera de muchas oportunidades de encuentro que vamos a tener. Muchas gracias. Démosle un aplauso a Nanco. So, Nanco, thank you very much for sharing with us today. And our students are very pleased to have this meeting with you. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. And you're welcome. Good luck. And yeah, I already shared you the presentation in the PDF.
You take care. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bueno, vamos a pasar asistencia con unas hojas verdes que están circulando. Fíjense, recuerden colocar nombre, código y la clase en la cual están inscritos. Muchas gracias por su participación y esperamos verlos pronto.